In order for somebody to truly understand something, their brain needs to hear all the pieces that make it make sense to them, make it make logical sense. I know this may be difficult for some leaders, marketers, comms people, salespeople to hear, but problem and solution is not enough for something to make sense to somebody.
Helping you create loyal customers and loyal employees, all through the power of simplicity. This is the Simple Brand Podcast, now heard around the world, including Collierville, Tennessee. I'm your host, Matt Lyles, and this week I'm talking with Tamsen Webster. But that's right, Tamsen Webster's back. She was first on the Simple Brand Podcast back in episode 75, where we discussed her book, Find Your Red Thread. And go check out that episode if you haven't already heard it. This time, we're discussing lessons from her latest book, Say What They Can't Unhear, The 9 Principles of Lasting Change. Part message designer, part English-to-English translator, part magpie, Tamsen helps leaders craft their case for large-scale change. As a sought-after speaker and consultant, she spent more than 25 years developing the field and practice of persuasive message design, with a particular focus on the principles and processes that build buy-in that lasts. Now listen, it doesn't matter your business or your industry. If you're a leader, you're a change agent, or at least you need to be. Change is inevitable, whether it happens to you and your team, or, even better, whether you recognize the need for change and work to lead your team through that change. Now, unfortunately, around 70% of change initiatives ultimately fail in the long run. Okay, now consider how much most organizations' ability to survive and thrive depend on change. That makes that stat pretty significant. So why this much failure? Well, it comes from the critical mistake that most leaders make when they're trying to introduce and drive that change. Spoiler alert, it's when leaders fail to connect the change to what their audience, what their people already care about. And that's just the start. If you want to drive lasting change that creates sustained action, then there are some key principles that you need to follow in order to give your audience a reason to believe and a reason to commit to that change. Thankfully, Tamsen's lessons focus on these principles and how you can better understand and apply them. And that's exactly what we discuss in this episode. So here it is. Here's my interview with Tamsen Webster. Hey, Tamsen. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well, especially
Excellent.
after having read Say What You Can't Unhear.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. It was definitely a passion project as I was just writing the thank you note to my publisher, and I'm very happy to have written it. I'm very happy that it's out. I'm very happy to be talking to you about it.
Last time you were on the show, we were talking about Find Your Red Thread.
Yep.
So talk to me about what led you from Find Your Red Thread to Say What They Can't Unhear.
So Find Your Red Thread is very much a how book. How can you make your ideas irresistible by putting it into the structure that our brains unconsciously understand every time? So that was a process of saying, here's what story is, here's my approach to it, here's how you break your idea into those pieces, here you put it back together and present it to people so that you really maximize the understanding of the idea. And then I noticed something. I noticed that even when things are perfectly architected in story structure or explained with a story, that it wasn't always successful to drive action, drive change, to accomplish some of the reasons why people were using the red thread in the first place. So that put me on the hunt. And I was like, why is that? Because if story is the answer, like in the final answer, then it should work, but it doesn't. So there must be something else. What is that other thing? I started down a rabbit hole that was prompted by a long-time storytelling maxim that a story is an argument. And I started to think, okay, well, it's clearly an argument for a course of action or against, depending on the nature of the story. But then that made me think about, like, well, what is an argument made of? What is leading to that conclusion in the first place? And what that helped me unlock was this layer underneath story, which is the layer of belief and principle. And suddenly all of it became clear. Suddenly, now I've fully understood, I think, what is the logic of emotion. What is it that we have to understand, both intuitively and intellectually, and agree with before we will be internally motivated to act? So with this last piece in place, I was like, very few in the business world, in the change
Right.
communication world, in the thought leadership world know these principles. And it doesn't seem like anybody else is talking about them. So I am going to. So that's a long way of saying where the Find Your Red Thread was very much a how book. Say What They Can't Unhear is very much a why book and what you need to know, which turns out to be a pretty good how book as well.
Oh, yeah.
But that's how I got there.
Nice. I think that there are some groups of people, some practitioners that do get this, whether it's in psychology, psychological behavior, neuroscience.
Yes,
But
exactly.
to your point, on the business side, change management, they're not getting it. So where's the disconnect? Where's the big gap?
One of the things that's fascinating to me is that just the business world cherry picks and borrows concepts from all over the place.
Yeah.
And yet there has been this skip over one of the basic building blocks of everything that business is looking for. We talk about persuasion, we talk about influence, we talk about change, we talk about action, we talk about innovation. And all of it starts with making sure the people that you're talking to understand what you're talking about. I mean, I know that sounds super obvious, but what that means is there's a whole category of information that the business world, and I have thoughts on why, has pretty much ignored. And that's how is it that adults, people with experience that they bring to the table, pre-existing beliefs, behaviors,
Right.
frames of reference, perspectives, come to understand new things. Why I think that's happened is because a huge amount of management theory came up during the command and control, during the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, where a lot of management theory was very much about the leader, about what the leader could do. And it really wasn't until the late 90s, the 2000s, that leadership theory even started to pay attention to the followers, which is how they're referred to in management theory. Even then, it was more about, well, what's the relationship between the leader and the follower? I'm like, we need to pay attention to what's happening on the other side. It's just been this slow evolution over to paying attention. I'm like, oh my gosh, the people in business are important too. I think now is the right time to really be thinking about, well, how do those people receive information? Not just how do we give it, but how do those people receive information? There's a lot we can learn. And so let's bring that into the language and the concepts, kind of translate it into the kinds of things that business people are familiar with, so that these concepts that are very familiar to other fields start to feel very familiar, even if they're new, to the business world.
When it comes to that management theory that so many leaders are so ingrained in, especially those that are at that senior executive level because they've been in their careers for so long, I think there's a mindset of, if it's important to me as a leader, then it should be important to my people.
Yes.
And then when a leader is crafting some new thing, some new change that they want to drive, they spend a pretty good deal of time creating it. They may spend a few months by themselves or with some of their people. They may go off with some of their own executives on a long weekend retreat, and they spend a lot of time crafting, and they've got all this knowledge built into it, and they lob it over the fence or announce it one time to their people and just automatically expect their people, one, to know what they're talking about, and two, to immediately buy into it.
So we presume understanding. We presume that because we are in the same company, we're speaking the same language, that we're using words that people recognize, that takes care of it.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't. These are the things that I had built into. So say what they can't on here is the principles that I built into Find Your Red Thread. But this kind of backs up and say, okay, let's be clear. In order for somebody to truly understand something, their brain needs to hear all the pieces that make it make sense to them, make it make logical sense. I know this may be difficult for some leaders, marketers, comms people, salespeople to hear, but problem and solution is not enough for something to make sense to somebody.
Right.
If we go back and say that truly story is the framework that our brains need to make sense of something, the problem and the solution are simply the beginning and the end of the story. They're the things that somebody wants and a decision to get that thing. But there's no logical connection until if we just give the problem and solution, there's actually no logical connection to those two things. So if we leave that blank, which is part of what I talked about in the first book, if we leave that blank, if we don't say that quiet part out loud, people will fill in with their pre-existing stories because what else do they have to draw on?
Right.
And this is where so much well-intentioned change communication goes completely wrong because we're like, well, it makes sense to me that these two things are connected. But none of us really see the world exactly the same way. So part of this book is very much kind of a call to arms. I don't want to get violent about it. I'm saying we have to say the quiet part out loud.
Right.
Not because your audience isn't smart enough, but because all of us are subject to something that's known as the false consensus effect, the belief that other people see the world the way that we do. Or in the rare cases that we kind of acknowledge that people don't, that we are the ones that are objective and clear and logical and everybody else isn't. I'm in the camp of let's just like maximize probability of success here. So even if that's true, that you're the only logical one in the play, and you're not.
Yeah. Spoiler alert.
Exactly. What does it hurt to check to make sure, A, that somebody's got everything they need to understand, and B, and this is really the other main message of the book, that we've tuned that argument, we've tuned all those pieces for maximum agreement with the people that we're talking to. And that means we have to use their pre-existing beliefs, their pre-existing principles, the ones we share with them to make that connection, not just the ones that we think are the ones that make the most sense. We have to find the ones that actually make sense to both you and them.
It sounds like when it comes to the upfront work, the prep work that's needed to craft and present that change, it's missing that gap of finding out what your people already believe and how you can bridge that gap.
Right. And a lot of times it even stumbles out of the starting gate. Think of it in terms of physics. It's easier to keep something going in the direction it's already traveling, correct? Right? Like it takes a force in order to move something off of its track. So using that same principle, our minds are the same way, by the way. It's called cognitive inertia, same principle. And what happens is, like, a lot of times we present a change in the context of an outcome that is not the one that our audience is already moving towards. So we're asking them not only to do something different, we're asking them to do it in a different direction after something that they aren't maybe currently interested in pursuing, that is not on the track that they're on. So one of the simplest changes that we can make, one of the simplest checks we can put in place when we're making a case for change is to anchor it in something that the people we're talking to are already moving towards, something that they already want, a question they are already pursuing an answer to, a challenge that they're already trying to overcome. And that may be different, but ideally related to what the challenges that you or a leader are looking at. I mean, leaders tend to look more strategically across the organization, but your team is looking much more tactically to what's right in front of them. And that tiny little shift of here's what I know you are trying to get to every day. And yeah, you can roll it up to the thing that you, the leader, are paying attention to. But even that little tiny shift makes someone go, oh, now I see how this big thing, or even just this little change, is actually relevant to me. And I don't have to get off of the path that I'm on right now in order to fulfill this ask, in order to make this change, in order to just even to learn more.
And that makes it, I guess that can make them more comfortable in it and realize I don't have to completely turn around everything that I'm doing. I can still focus on what I'm doing.
Exactly.
But for the leader,
go ahead.
Well, how can they go about making sure that they get that answer, making sure that they understand their people and what their people are already driving towards or what's in front of their people?
I mean, some of this is classic leadership behavior. And so my experiences and what I've seen over and over again is that people know way more about their people, not always, but way more about their people than a lot of times they give themselves credit for. Now, it doesn't mean they always do, but at the very least, if you don't know what people, let's say 2 tiers down in the organization, are going after every day, the tier below you does, the one that you're talking to, right? So there's always people who are aware of what it is that the people around them are pursuing, right? And I'm not saying necessarily that this is personal things. I mean, we can look very tactically on, look at the KPIs that you've established in the organization, not just, okay, here's what the big strategic goal is for the organization for this 6 months, for this year, for the next 5 years, whatever it might be. And for most organizations, we've translated that down into what that's going to look like for somebody's day-to-day operations.
Right.
Well, simply putting something in the context of, this is going to help you, like, since we're trying to achieve this goal, since we're trying to make sure that we hit these numbers, since we're trying to increase the retention rates of our clients and customers, we can make it super specific. And also we can rely on some of the things that are generally always true about organizations. What is one question that every leader is trying to answer? How can we do more with less? Like, how can we make more money, spend less money? How can we attract more of the better people? How can we get people on board? These are classic questions. And sometimes that's enough to get started. Because even just framing something from that perspective of, here's why we are looking to make this change, because we are trying to achieve this thing that we're all working towards. Here's why we think that will happen. Even if you break it into components, parts, and just try to secure understanding and agreement each of those pieces, say, okay, it's my belief as the leader or as your leader that this is something that we're all trying to work towards. Yes? Now, if you don't get a yes right there, that is an amazing opportunity for a discussion.
That's it. Yeah.
That's it. I mean, because it's just like, just check. So I see that you've got Purple Cow at the top of your stack over there.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
It's a very recognizable book, even from this. But I mean, Seth Godin was known for permission marketing, right? I see this as very much as permission persuasion. And it starts with, are you even interested in the outcome that this thing will provide you with? Is this even a question that you are looking to answer? Because if it's not, then we have bigger problems than just how to frame the change. You know, just like a marketing message isn't going to solve a product problem,
right? Change
communication is not going to solve a change that isn't in the best interest of the organization or its people. It's just not. And so honestly, I think that the approach that I am suggesting in this book is very much an act of bravery, because what it does is it moves the risk of change onto the person asking for it. Now, I want to say that again. What it does is it moves the risk of change onto the person asking for it. Now, the reason why I think that's so important is because what I see, I get the question often, why is change so hard? And I'm like, it's not. We change every way, every day, all the time. No day operates according to plan. We actually change all the time. What
Yeah,
we
we're
don't
always
like
changing.
to do is risky change, change that we perceive as risky. So if we don't know what a change is going to get for us, we don't know who else is going to benefit, we don't know why we're being asked, we don't know how we're being asked to do it and what the intent and motivation is behind that, well, that's pretty freaking risky, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times we're saying, do this, it's good for you. You're like, I don't know, right? But by
Partly
presenting
believe
something from
that.
but starting from that perspective of, I believe that this outcome is important. Do you? Just that moment of
Yeah.
saying, I believe this. Do you agree? Is a moment of real risk for the person asking for it. But in my mind, if you believe in this change, that's where the risk belongs. And people saying, I don't agree with you. But if we don't give them the information with which to agree, then we never do that. And again, we're putting the risk on them and we're making the potential change harder, not just on them, but on us. So even if you're coming at this for very selfish motivations, like it's way harder to get a change across if people really don't understand where the risk is and isn't, what your motivation is for asking for it, and fundamentally what's in it for them.
One of the things that I've been talking about with others lately is the value of co-creation, working with
Yes.
others to co-create things. And so that's one of the things that I was thinking about with this. And then when you mentioned like at least asking the people at that tier below you or at the right tiers, I'm curious like how it may or may not help to have representation from others to help in co-creating the messaging around the change.
Uh, yes. I mean, absolutely. And part of the impetus for this book was that I saw over and over again that when I was brought into these companies and these boardrooms to work on messaging, what I saw was a benefit that was coming out of it was actually a full-on buy-in into the approach of the change. Because in order to actually be able to explain it to people, you have to be able to put it into words that people will understand. You have to actually create a case for it. And by doing that work as a team, whether that's leadership or whether that's a group, a mixed group of saying, what do we all agree? And really all agree is the desired outcome. What do we agree to our core as an organization is necessary for achieving that? Like what must be part of that approach? What is part of our kind of deep-seated organizational narrative, our principles, not the ones we say we wish were true, the ones that are actually the ones that drive what we do. When you do that with a group, and even again, you can do it all at once. I've done it both ways with clients where we're kind of everybody's all in the room together, or we start with one group and then we bring the next group in, refine, and we bring the next group in, refine. And what you end up getting is kind of all the things that you would want. In order to get this thing that somebody is interested in, understands, and agrees with, we have to do the work with the people to say, does it pass the test of, am I interested in this? Do I understand it? Do I agree with it? And by the time that we get to a point where everybody understands, everybody agrees, and we've anchored it in things that people agree are kind of valuable and interesting, then you've ended up getting people on board and defining who you're actually for, because now you're actually for the people who are asking that question that this change will provide. You've identified at least two of the actual principles in use in the organization, not the ones that we aspire to, but the ones that we're actually using to guide what we do. And we've been able to do that and put it together in a way that we know is tuned as much as possible for maximum agreement, maximum understanding, and maximum interest for the folks that we're actually for. And we're doing that very quickly. So you asked before, like, what do we miss? What do we do? And like a lot of times what we're doing is we're missing that people have to understand and agree in principle with something before they'll agree to do anything in practice. And by the way, for a leader who is also motivated to reduce risk, isn't that a less risky strategy to say, let me make sure, let's get everybody's agreement to this whole thing in principle before we start investing millions of dollars in this change effort? That's also a much less risky piece. Now, implementation have to happen? Absolutely. Do we need resources? Absolutely. Are there people who are not going to be on board? Absolutely. Does that raise other questions? Yes, it does.
Yeah.
But now we have actually inserted a step that doesn't take that long and pays ultimate dividends going forwards.
I have to think, though, that it's not the idea of bringing all the cooks into the kitchen where you have too many cooks in the kitchen and you end up creating this Frankenstein type messaging. Mm-hmm. It's more around having the right people see it and say, okay, here's what it is. What are we missing? Like based on your perspective, based on the people that you represent, where are some tiny gaps that need to be filled?
Right. And where do you predict that people are going to go,
Yes.
It's not going to pass. It's not going to pass the smell test. And that's important, right? Nobody understands better than an organization's employees where there are gaps between what they say and what they do.
Right.
Nobody knows it better. I have worked in and for a number of organizations, and you almost feel it viscerally when you're like looking at a message go out into the marketplace and you're like, that is not what we do.
Yeah.
Like,
did you see what we said? Yeah.
Did you see what we said? I'm like, oh, there goes like the marketing, the marketing team must be drunk again, so it's, and I'm saying this as a lifelong marketer, and no, I never did my job drunk. But you know the perspective, right? A lot of people are like, well, there goes marketing. And poor marketers are going, it's because you gave me nothing to work with, guys. So I'm trying to go with what's going to at least get people interested. If you can't close the deal, that's on you. Again, if we can get the folks that you trust as a leader to be representative of what you want the organization to be, do stand for. In other words, get that representation of your ideal team, right?
Yeah.
Whether that's, I don't care where they are in the organization, you're looking for the people who are like, these are the people I want to move this organization forward. Those are the people you need in that room. Because those are the people who are going to be able to say, yeah, we understand what we're trying to do. We've got it. We're willing to steward it. We're willing to advocate for it. And we care enough about this organization to critique it constructively and tell you and be honest with you when there's a gap that we need to close, and also to tell you what we can do. I mean, just as a quick example, I spent 4.5 years fairly early in my career as the director of marketing and communications for a performing arts college here in Boston. It was Boston Conservatory. It's now part of Berklee College of Music. And when I first got there, they talked about an interdisciplinary education. And I was like, well, that sounds fascinating. Very interesting. And then the longer I was there, the more I realized, like, this is not interdisciplinary, my loves. Like, this is aspirational. I know you wish it were, but really what we've got here is a multidisciplinary environment. Now, there's value there too. But that was one of those moments where I said, listen, I care about this organization. I care about what we're doing, but we're doing damage to ourselves when we say one thing, which people are going to interpret one way. And then they come here and they're like, that's not what's going on. But we can make the case for multidisciplinary right now and make the case that there's value there. So let's go with that. Meanwhile, let's do the work to get us to be interdisciplinary, at which point we can start to use that language. I'm not saying that I'm like the dream employee, but you want people who are willing to say, I'm going to call you on that. That's not going to fly. It's not going to fly long term. Now, if you're only interested from a leadership standpoint, if you're short time in it, if you're like lame duck in it, or you're like, I'm just looking for those next quarterly results, none of this applies to you, because there are things that you can do to get people to do something that will work in a short time frame.
In the short time frame, yeah.
But the vast majority of the things that will work in the short time frame not only don't work in the long term, which is why we see customer and employee churn, and it's why we see buyer's remorse. It's why we see spectacular brand failures and merger and acquisition failures, by the way, right? Because those things don't work long-term and in some cases are absolutely opposite of what's required for long-term agreement, long-term change, long-term sustained action. And so, again, back to de-risking this whole change process, I would rather put the effort in to get someone to act in a way that starts or keeps their motivation of action going rather than get that movement. But then everything else after that is facing so much friction that change just stops in its tracks. Like that doesn't seem unrisky to me or inexpensive or not damaging to the trust and the faith that people would put into you as a leader. I've spent a lot of time like looking at this, working with companies to try to solve it. And I'm just like, listen, yeah, we got to fix this. This is a fixable problem. Let's fix it.
It is, but you can solve so much just by doing a lot of that upfront work. But then talking about getting the right people in the room to help with this, to make sure that you're getting constructive criticism.
Yes.
And you mentioned this as well. Like we know there's going to be some people that are just going to dig their heels in, not want to do this. Yeah. So early in the book, you talk about this and it jumped out to me. And I love seeing it because it's something that I tried to focus on whenever I was trying to drive change in my corporate career. How should we go about understanding the categories of stakeholders or proposed change and how they'll affect and how should we approach those stakeholders?
There are so many different approaches to thinking about this. And what is significant to me as somebody who is relentlessly pattern driven, you may have figured this out by looking at me, that they all look roughly the same, right? Whether we're talking about the technology adoption curve, whether we're talking about the stages of grief, whether we're talking about kind of where your advocacy are, all of it falls in one sense or another, kind of like a bell curve, right? There's a small proportion of people who are on board no matter what with a change, or if we're talking about technology, they're game for it. Like anything Apple puts out, even if it doesn't seem to have any purpose right now, like people will buy it. Some people will buy it just because it's Apple and they're like way up there. The same thing is going to be true for your business. There are people in every organization that are like, the organization can do no wrong. I'm a lifer. I'm doing, yes, whatever. Yes. Those are great. You love those people. You do not need to spend a huge amount of time with those people other than supporting them, validating them, equipping them to take that excitement and use it with the other people.
That's it. Yeah.
Because without them understanding that their excitement isn't enough, they're saying, we should do this, isn't enough. With them saying, all these benefits will happen, isn't enough, then they're just repeating the errors that you may be repeating at scale. Not great, right? In other words, you've got people who are talking peer to peer without the information that all the people in the middle need. And again, if those people in the middle aren't hearing what they need to hear, we've got a problem. I'll come back to the middle in just a moment. Because at the other end, we know those people too. And those are the antagonists. And they're the ones that they're like automatic reaction to pretty much anything is no.
Yeah.
Some of those people will be changeable and some of them will not. That opens up to you as a leader, your choice for how you choose to lead. Some leaders choose to find other places for those people and invite them to explore other opportunities. Some leaders say it's important to have those contrary voices and want to make sure those people feel heard, again, which I'm hoping this process in this book helps to supply that. But other folks are sitting in that antagonist group. So I call that happy group the actives and that kind of angry group the antagonists, because they are kind of oftentimes actively working against you. Sometimes they're antagonists because of something you and I were talking about earlier, Matt, and that is they just haven't heard the connection in between the change in the outcome or the change in something they want. And so they're filling in with something that are like, no, doesn't make sense. Those folks also need the information. They may not agree, but again, sometimes it is possible to move them at least in the middle, if not all the way to active, if it's tied to something that they actively are pursuing, something they actively want, and it's based in principles that they actively agree with, right? That are already familiar to them, that are in line with how they see the world, how they see the organization, how they think things should work. Now, it's the middle groups that are fascinating to me. So with the antagonists, give them the information they need to truly understand where they are, right? Or to move, and then deal with them and work with them as appropriate, given that. The interesting thing to me is the middle. Now, when I sent this book out to free readers, so I sent it to peer reviewers and I sent it to some beta reviewers, and I had more than one person saying, there's only one group, it's just the middle. And I'm like,
oh,
there's actually two different kinds of people in the middle.
Yep.
And the biggest distinction between the two kinds of people in the middle is whether or not they care. What I mean by that is whether or not they care about changing. Some people don't care about change, so they're like, whatever, it's fine. Other people don't care about the outcome, or both, right? They don't care. It doesn't matter. Like, they're just go along to get along. Everything's fine, whatever. I'm just here. I'm cashing my paycheck. I'll do whatever you need to do. And they just can't be bothered to even be angry about it, right? They don't even care enough to work against the change. Do you see what I mean? Like, that's a group. So I call that group the indifferents, because they're indifferent to everything. They're indifferent to working against the change. They're indifferent to the change. They're probably indifferent to the organization. They're not doing any damage, but they're kind of dead weight as far as the change goes. They can be moved, again, because if you can connect it to something they care about, then you might actually move them to the other group or to the actives. And this leaves my favorite overlooked group. And this is the group that I call the ambivalents.
Right.
And there is a difference between people who are indifferent to something, those are the people who don't care, and people who are ambivalent about it. A lot of times we use those two words interchangeably. They are not interchangeable. Ambivalent means that they are actually pulled equally in opposite directions. They may care about the outcome, for instance. They actually want this thing to happen, but they know that they may be one of those people that it directly affects their job and their position. And so this is where, if we're talking about merger and acquisition, this is where the kind of golden parachute for the person who's redundant comes into play. Because again, you have to you have to do something that tips the ambivalent person in one direction or another. You may not be able to tip them internally, though that's the ideal. But the ambivalents are ripe for change. They are actively looking for information to decide where they actually fall. Are they actually going to be ultimately for this change and become an active? Or are they hearing information that ultimately tips them against it? Because they're actively looking for information, those are the folks to really make sure that you are very, very planful and strategic and honest with. Because those are the people whose BS detector is really high. Because as far as they're concerned, they've got a lot at stake, because there's at least two things they care about so much, and they are already aware that this is a choice between either what they perceive as irreconcilable goods, as a storyteller would call it, or between, again, borrowing from storytelling, two bad options, right? They've got a lot at risk no matter which way they go. So their BS detector is super, super high. So this is not a place where you can just sugarcoat anything. It's where you really need to take on that risk yourself and say, this is why I believe this. And if you know that person's going to lose something in those people, that person is going to lose something in that transaction, that you acknowledge it and you provide a legitimate counterbalance to whatever that loss is going to be.
Yeah. I mean, like, be upfront and transparent and honest as possible.
Yes. I know. It's crazy.
Yeah. That right there at least gives you a few more points in your favor with those ambivalents.
Right. Because again, change aversion is risk aversion.
Yeah.
And everything that you say to somebody, in every way that you say it, communicates information. So your tone of voice, what information you give them, how you give it to them, when you give it to them, in what way you give it to them. All of this communicates information that may or may not be interpreted the way that you want it to be. There was researchers at MIT that talk about, I do mention this in the book, where your intent seeps out of you unless you're a complete sociopath. Truly, most people cannot hide their underlying intent, at least not over time. And if you're talking with your team members, they know you. So they have had a lot of time to collect information about when to trust you and when not to trust you. And you don't know what that data storage is in their head. So again, just from the perspective of raising probability of success, be kind, but say what you mean, because anything else is going to reveal itself over time. And you're not only going to not get that change you're looking for in the moment, you're probably going to damage that relationship long term. And I don't think that's worth it. Ever.
No, not at all. That's a good lesson for any leader trying to drive change in their team, or it's a good lesson just in your own personal life too.
Yes, this book also applies. Yeah, exactly. I mean, yes, it was written for leaders. That's where I do my work. But a lot of the underlying principles come from, lived experience. They come from seeing what actually works with people.
Yeah.
Because I am of the belief that nothing happens at the organizational level that doesn't happen at the individual level first. And that's true even when you're not in a Western organization with Western philosophy and the Western prizing of individualism.
Right.
Even when we're talking about cultures and organizations that follow a much more collective thing, these changes still happen. The support and the belief still happens up here. And really what that means is that the principles upon which people are going to find that comfort are going to just be based, again, culturally, whether that's layers of culture, individual culture, organizational culture, culture, and all of those layers in between. So this is really about excavating to that core. There's a reason why I call this, kind of your core case, or really your core philosophy, core theory behind this change, because, it's not an argument in the traditional sense. It's not convincing people. It's not getting people to do things. It's not even you persuading them. It's you presenting what persuaded you.
Wow.
And for other people, what you're trying to do is to architect it in such a way and articulate it in such a way where you are providing to them recognizable truths, things that they recognize as true out of the gate. No data or support needed. Beliefs, lived experience, internal data, recognizable truths that create, crystallize, or corrupt how they see the world. Those are the things that people can't unhear. When you can present those recognizable truths in service of, again, something that they agree is true and something that they want, it really becomes an extraordinarily powerful basis and foundation, not just for understanding an agreement, but for transformational change.
And that leads to the last question I wanted to ask, which is like outside of the business realm. So you're a mom. You have two sons.
I do.
How do you see these principles tying to
sons at that too?
I know. So just a whole different type of relationship.
Yes.
How do you see these principles tying to parenting and how you can persuade your children's behavior?
Okay.
Yeah.
The goal of this book is when you are looking to inspire internally motivated action. Okay. So that is the big caveat. So as parents, do you have the ability to impose persuasion, right? Absolutely. But I think there are times when, especially as we're trying to shape these beings, to be, successful humans. I'm also the belief that it's not my job to make my children in my image. It's my job to, share the best I can, right? But also to love them and respect them for who they currently are and who they currently want to be. And some of that, to be honest, I mean, I am not throwing my parents under the bus. They did the best that they could. And I think
Most
that a
do.
lot of the parenting beliefs at the time were this idea of, I even remember my mother and one of her good friends, like they shared something with each other on Facebook, and I saw the interaction. It was like, my job as a parent is to want it even when they don't. And I was like, that right there explains a whole lot. Again, but again, if that's culturally where they came from, like that's going to create a whole thing. But what that does in an incredibly, and I know in my parents' case, unintentional way, is that it makes love and respect feel conditional. It makes it feel like you will be worthy of our love when you do this, when you fulfill this expectation, when you achieve this thing. Not, you're awesome, you're doing great, to quote my friend Michael Bungay's Sanye, you're awesome, you're doing great, doing a great job, and I'm here for you. I'm not always going to agree with you. I'm not even always going to like you. But my job, number one, is to love you no matter what. Okay, that's a lot of caveats. So what I come back to with this is that there are two principles, and all of the principles apply to parenting, by the way. But that's kind of my summation of how I think they apply. But there's really two principles specifically that speak to it. Number one, that change, internally motivated change, isn't just an action, it's a reaction. And I want you to think about reaction as a repeated action. So to get someone to change, they have to be able to repeat the action on their own, even when you're not there. And in order to do that, you kind of have to do everything else I've talked about. They have to hear a story that they can tell themselves over and over and over again in a way that doesn't diminish them, in a way that moves them towards the thing that they want, in a way that assumes already that they are smart, capable, good, worthy of love and respect, no matter what they end up choosing to do. But your job as a parent is to present that information to them in a way that's conceptually appropriate for where they are right now. And so that can mean, hey, babe, I've been there too. And, this is what I think about that. Like, this is my choice. You don't have to do the same thing, but here's what I learned. And when I say you don't have to do the same thing, I have to mean it, which is where the 8th principle comes in. You can't want it more than they do, because my values have been built over my 50 years on earth. They've got 14 and 16.
Right.
And they have a completely different experience growing up than I did, right? I mean, completely. I am full Gen X. I remember chalk on chalkboards. I remember manual typewriters. I remember 8-tracks. Like, it's so different. I mean, I was reading such a fascinating article that was in response to Atlantic article. I know that says it, about a teacher talking about the degree to which our Gen Z and Gen Alpha kids, the degree to which their language and their dialect of English is changing so rapidly that their natural language to ours, not to mention all the way back to like Shakespeare, which we're trying to teach them, is as different as our native language is to Middle English. And I don't know if you've ever tried to read Middle English. It is like, what?
Yeah.
Like, and so,
maybe every third word I get.
And that's right. So my job is not necessarily to like try to be all Gen Z and Alpha, unless I really want to embarrass them, which is super fun. But they know I'm doing it out of because they know when I'm embarrassing them. And I don't, and I don't do it in public. I just,
And do it sparingly.
I do it sparingly.
Yeah.
But it really does come down to you. I cannot want a thing more than they do. And the last thing that I ever want to do for my kids is make them doubt what I have always said is, job number one for me as mom, which is to love them no matter what. Number two is keep them safe. Love them no matter what, to keep them safe. But number one is love them no matter what. And sometimes 1 and 2 are going to be in conflict.
Yeah.
But my job is to love them no matter what, and to make sure that I am living my life and parenting them and co-parenting them in such a way where they have no cause to doubt that. Do I always live up to that? I'm sure that I do not. And I am sure that my kids will be in therapy as much as I was about mine. but I'm doing the best I can. And I think that that's the standard that's the only standard any of us can hold ourselves truly to. And that's the credit I want to give to them, is that in any given moment, I believe that they are doing the best they can. And fundamentally, that's principle 4, by the way, that identity is the greatest influencer.
Yeah.
We have this incredibly important role of helping our kids shape themselves into who they want to be. And that language is intentional, to help them shape themselves into who they want to be. And who they want to be is always going to be the greatest influencer of their action. So if we don't love that, then we do not have a hope of influencing them in any way, shape, or form. So that is my soapbox on that topic. There we go.
That's it. So it applies everywhere, but especially
I think so. Yeah, it's my giant hammer.
Too. Hooray.
It does.
Cool.
It does. Yeah.
Oh, Tamsen, I have really enjoyed this. I've enjoyed the book. I've learned so much from the book. I always learn so much from you. But where can people go to learn more?
Well, the book is great for that. So they can go to littlechangebook.com, which will take them to all the places online and off they can find the book. But if you're interested in the how, right, first book will get you there, find your red thread. But I also this last year founded what I'm calling the Message Design Institute, which is really designed to teach people at whatever level they choose and can afford to how to do this on their own. So it's in its early stages, but that's really what I'm hoping to be, is that this is where you will find as much as you want to know about why this works, how to put in action, and really start to make the changes you want to see in the world.
How exciting. Yeah, love seeing that being built up and coming together. Congrats on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, Tamsen, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. This was fun. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my discussion with Tamsen Webster. You can learn more from her at tamsenwebster.com. From keynotes to courses to workshops, Tamsen's got a lot of ways to help you and your team ensure you're able to persuade others from making change. And Tamsen's got a free resource for you as well, the Compact Case. It's a simple tool designed to help you apply the principles of say what they can't unhear to your own case for change. You can access the resource at thecompactcase.com. I've got a link to it in the show notes as well. And be sure and grab your copy of Tamsen's book, Say What They Can't Unhear. If you're enjoying the Simple Brand podcast, go ahead, hit the subscribe button. It's going to make it so much simpler for you to get future episodes like the next one featuring Michael Henshaw. We'll be discussing lessons from his latest book, Experience Rules, the Experience Operating System and 8 Keys to Enable It. So go ahead and subscribe. You'll automatically get Michael's episode as soon as it's live. Until then, keep it simple.